I want to introduce the first two speakers. The first one is Richard Volpato, and then we're going to have Brigitte Leroux. I just want to say about these two speakers that fortunately they coincided with the first session because they are the, let's say, the biggest benzocrists that I know. The one comes from Australia, very far away, probably the furthest away that anybody came to this conference, and the other one is very local, and he's going to talk about letting data speak. He works in the Copyright Agency in Sydney. For the whole of Australia, he's responsible for all the data that's to do with the copywriting of text, and he handles huge amounts of data. And I'm so pleased, Richard, that you could come, and we look forward to your talk, Letting Data Speak. Thank you. Richard Volpato.
Bonjour, good morning. I shan't cause us to descend into informality by saying g'day. I will just, first of all, point out what I'm going to do. The topic here is letting data speak, and the reason why I've picked on this notion is that I've used correspondence analysis now for about 25 years, and it's been truly remarkable how much people come to speak through data and with data with an ease that they wouldn't otherwise have had they not been exposed to this kind of thinking. Just to give you an idea of the constraints I'm going to be working on here, so this may speed up a bit, is I've come over 10,000 kilometers to talk for less than 1,000 seconds to tell you that correspondence analysis is more than just a protocol for domesticating data. It's actually a way of life, a praxis. It's something that can be truly transforming. So let me go on to this. As Michael mentioned, I work at the Copyright Agency, but I'm not, as you might think, tied to publishers controlling content. The Copyright Agency in Australia is actually one of the few places where copying is actually allowed without asking for permission. We monetize usage. We don't merchandise the permission. That means that billions of pages of copies, billions of internet pages looked at, all that data comes in through surveys that I look at, and from that we harvest many millions of dollars, 150 millions of dollars, and pass it to creators, track them down, pay them money. As a result, there's a vast ecology of creativity in the nation, which again is something I look at, and correspondence analysis in that context provides a very powerful way to see many little strange innovations in the way people produce and consume culture. This diagram, this woodcut that you see on the screen there, Veritas Filia Temporis. This has become something of an icon for me. I came across it in an obscure book in Cambridge a few months before I tracked down benzocrine. It's actually significant because it provides a picture that actually has come true in so many ways, which is it's all very well to pursue the truth, but insofar as you achieve it, very quickly other forces come to play to bury it again. And so there you see Father Time pulling truth out from the mire of darkness, and Columnia coming in to push truth back into its place. And it's a very common structure for a lot of thematics, that you have a rescuer, a victim, and a tormentor, and away they go, creating some history, drama, and so on. It's relevant here because, and here's a quote from benzocrine, which is one of those quotes is typically stunning. Statistics is not a means of knowledge. It is not a means of knowledge, draining into an idea the flood of facts. It's a mode of being. And as such, it raises the question of how do you engage being? And one of the ways we've got to think about this is in every epoch, different cultures carry their culture in different ways. So we have Platonic, Hellenic traditions which responded to the existence of alphabets and writing. Then we have printing, and so we get Descartes, because then we can have precision and certainty. I want to walk in life with certainty, Descartes would put in the rules and directions of mind. And then we have media, where we have subjectivity and the notion of experience. And now we have data, and it's yet not yet a fully appreciated cultural resource, an infrastructure for carrying the culture. Ben Zakri is one of the few people I find that actually gets this idea and actually has a way to engage data in all its richness. We speak of data today typically in the way a few centuries ago people talk about slaves. Damn useful, quiet, bring them in, put them out, give the result, end of story. The idea that they would have a voice and a way of participating in the world is not something that it took a while for people to get a grip on. Data is that sort of entity. It's a buried, hidden, mute structure, and statistics in particular finds ways to reduce it to a core set of insights. One of the things about correspondence analysis, of course, is it spatializes it all, and we see it in all its glory, in all its diversity. Okay, let's take a simple example here. Greenacre's smoking thing that's now proliferating worldwide and across software and discussions. What do you see, and what do you want to know if you see this table? The first thing people do with tables is they look at the numbers. They want to see patterns. But an innocent person, first and foremost, is going to look at the labels. The labels tell what it is you've walked into. So here we have an organization of some sort, presumably, where there are people of different seniority, people with different authority, and some smoke and some don't, and some smoke a lot and some a little. You can do a correspondence analysis of that, and you get a result which is actually quite compelling, but you can also do something else. And that one thing I always do with data, and it's interesting with correspondence analysis, particularly with a disjunctive matrix, you can take any column and focus on it. Because even with a simple table like that, why are you looking at it? Who smokes? But why do you want to know? Are you thinking about the smoker? Are you thinking about people you can get rid of smoking? Are you interested in the medium ones who might be converted because the heavy ones are too addicted? In that context, you pick one column, make it a focus of interest. And here we have a little diagram, a causal flow diagram, where we say, I figure, well, older folk, as they get older, some of them are more likely to then become managers. Older folk, because of history, are smokers. Managers, because of authority, therefore maybe don't smoke. And therefore, the least likely group to smoke would be the young managers. Now, the structure of that little causal diagram is very, very simple. And the beauty of it is if we take the table and simply percentage it internal to the rows that are the causal categories, we can get a percentage difference, which is effectively a regression coefficient. But the point is it's immediately verbalizable because we live and breathe by talking of differences. And people who have to make a decision about anything, go to war, marry, whatever, have to say yes or no to a decision. And as a result, they'll think about a category, about this person, that person, those types of people, this type of person. They don't think in terms of a space. The space is there for an onlooker looking at the panorama. But once you're actually going on in life, you're down in the actual forest doing something, turning left, turning right. What are you going to do? In that context, that little diagram you see is a way of formalizing a structure of tables which produces a string of verbalization. So, for example, I might start by saying, hey, I looked at this and think older folk take to cigarettes more often than younger people. As they age, some reach management where smoking becomes less frequent. Young managers most likely avoid this habit. I've left out secretaries because, one, there's only 25 of them. Two, I don't have the seniority there that's missing. That style of analysis goes back to Lazarsfeld. Raymond Boudon wrote a nice book, The Logic of Sociological Explanation, on the same thing. But James Davis, back in '84, formalized this in a very powerful tool. And I find this a very powerful way to take the bit-by-bit steps inside a data structure that someone's got to take and verbalize. So whether it's boards of companies or students, they all can start relating to percentages. Now, that's a very microscopic thing. It's like a little beetle walking in the forest. We have the aerial overview, which is much more where correspondence analysis lives. Here's an example from the World Value Surveys, which I've used a lot. Hundreds of thousands of interviews across 30 countries, across 20 years. You can find dispersion about anything there. Here's a simple example of values of survival values versus self-expression values and traditional versus secular rational. Scaled along a lot of items and you get a plot that looks like that. Now, that's something that if you were presenting, you might conclude with, because it's quite hard for people to relate to that. The bandwidth of what can be taken in a conversation is actually a lot smaller than what we tend to think of as we get sophisticated in statistics. So this is a way of thinking that we can write those little graphs one by one by one to build up a map. But the map in turn, if you get the large distances of similar variables, you know you're going to get a cross-tabulation that will give you a large percentage difference, which means you can verbalize more and more causal nuances. It doesn't have to be just causal. I'm just using that because it's the most common one that I've come across. How do you write with this? Now, most of you probably don't do each of these. I've done them many times to the grief and torment of many a student and embarrassment of many a manager. But anyway, blind writing. A good graph leaves a very nice short-term memory trace. Close your eyes, write. So in the labs where we used to teach, and I actually built one of the first in Australia in a university not unlike here, out in the rural settings. Anyway, for a good 10 years, we had the screens could be turned off. Turn the screen off. Students think, my graph's gone. Doesn't matter. It's in your mind, right? A good graph leaves a good trace. A bad graph doesn't leave a trace. You can't speak it. So one discipline is to make a graph that leaves a trace and then write it. Of course, people then write, they can't see, they make mistakes, they go, oh my God, this is terrible. Now when you turn the screen back on, you say, no, no, this is a baby. You have to learn to nurture it, clean it, make it look interesting, engaging. Of course you've made mistakes. One of the biggest problems in universities I used to find was they produce too large a superego, so people get, as they're young, for God's sake, they end up becoming autocritical, impressing the teacher. I'm so self-critical. Whereas here, you let go in all the mess that it is. E-prime writing, no use of the verb is, forces the verbs to become active, strong, process activities. As you see there, I've written a little bit of text. You'll see there's no is, and I'm trying to create a conversation. What I call paragraphic assent. Encapsulate, start with something that grabs the attention, exemplify, use concrete examples, explicate, using concepts and meanings, and finally elaborate by cross-linking variables with cases and leading to the next paragraph. With correspondence notes, you don't see it here in the diagram, but one of the things I've found is to write along a dimension, because inertia is actually the source of topicality. And interestingly enough, to name a dimension in correspondence analysis, I use the opposite logic, which is to try and find only those active variables that give many little contributions to the dimension, not one big one that's really obvious, like age, class, whatever. Hold that in reserve for validation. If you get a dimension that lines up with lots of contributions by many little players, like a whole stack of items from a questionnaire, you're onto something. And then follow the order of the eigenvalues so that the largest dispersion is the area of most topicality typically. Now, what did you just see there? Well, I want to show that Benzakery's actually got a very articulated view about what it even means to be informing and what it means to pursue the truth. Because in order to engage the data, and Benzakery clearly is very interested in data, and when I first met him, the thing that struck me was finally I found someone that's a data file. Not a bibliophile, but a data file. He actually loves data. Every bit of data matters. But the way you express that love for data is you show fidelity to the data. So you follow a rule here, don't speak unless the data lets you speak it. The tendency is very often to write some data, get a result, and then of course add all the other things we already know about Islam or about crime or about pollution or about global warming. Stick to the data. It forces the language to stay encased inside the space that the correspondence analysis is delivered. Benzakery actually has a concept for that. He uses it from his math supervisor called a filter, which is a very, very powerful idea, which I won't go into here, but it essentially opens up the data into a direction where you want to begin to extract upwards to things that really matter. But the other thing you do with a disjunctive matrix, if you go towards a BERT matrix especially, you find that it's actually organized in a way that people who think of themselves as experts can consume. Intervariate relationships. If you go the other way of clustering around the objects, you find something that people can relate to as experience. Yeah, he's a bit like the guy I met the other day, or this situation's like that, like the other object. And so you get the little ultrametric of close cousins in a space that's, interestingly enough, the same. So Benzacri's actually got this concept where expertise and experience, through the transition, through the duality diagram, comes back to data. And the only thing that keeps that alive in your mind is the fidelity you deliver to the data. Now that takes a lot of training. I used to spend, each of those arrows is a transformation set of rules. It takes me about 200 hours of intensive training per arrow, which is 1,200 hours of a person's life, and they become data savvy. They become a very distinct kind of intellect. Significantly, data doesn't just sit there. It's sitting like a sieve that goes into the flux and flow of events. And most of us are sitting there in the flux and flow of the river of life, typically rowing, yes, let's keep going, and we're looking to where we've been. It's very hard to turn around to see where we're going. And as people like managers, come on now, let's keep that stroke. Next one, keep it moving. Who's not rowing? That sort of concept is actually endemic in a lot of institutional fabric of the modern Western world. Data picks this stuff up, and once it is spatialized, engaged with fidelity, you can re-engage expertise and experience. Now, this is really weird here. I find this really provocative and different, is that Benzacri here has actually captured, by looking at experience and expertise, actually capturing a very Hellenic kind of thinking. He's actually brought together, like someone else did in Paris many years earlier, which I'll get to, Plato and Aristotle. The Platonic model was the idea, the form, the something that hovers above the riff-raff of appearances. But Benzacri says, no, it's not just that. It is like a crystal that can turn and capture attention. I'm nearly up to my 1,000 seconds. Anyway, the concept there is that what Plato does is sits in the idea, but Benzacri actually gently descends Plato. And on the other side with experience, you have the Aristotelian energia, all these forms of transformation inside, lots of activities, replicating and moving on. And Benzacri brings them both together, and interestingly enough, he brings them together by pushing them back towards pre-Socratic thinking, because on the Aristotelian side, all these energia of activities is like that flow, which, remember, Heraclitus would say, you can never step in the river twice. And you often hear that saying as in, I can't go into it ever again because it's changed. Whereas a Benzacrian reading of that Heraclitean fragment is, no, jump in now and it'll stay the same. You know, like you're paddling in there. Oh, this river is full of surprises, this one same river. You're in it. Whereas we've intellectualized and say, oh, I can't get into it ever again, so let's overthink it. So in that side, the whole idea of the notion of clustering actually brings together objects that become activities. That's why verbs matter here. And on the Platonic side, Plato was very much impressed with Parmenides, who had the phrase, thinking and being as one. Heidegger does a long translation about how you can change that, but I translate it into take care to lay bare what lies beyond what is. So you take what is, take the circumference of what's just nearby, and keep working out. Do not jump from where you are off to being in the know. So there's a very tight having to burrow out from the data to then speaking to people. Of course, once you do that, people find you surprising because you're saying things that they've never witnessed before. But there's more. The way data is talked about, and particularly with Benzacri, is it's Judaic. It's kind of this concern for the bits of data almost like little signs. It's almost like Kabbalah. It's a set of signs which, once aligned, let you know something. But it's also New Testament because there's this light that shines on it so that you begin to abstract upwards to what is going on around you. Let me just finally end here. I used to use this to introduce my statistics classes at university because people would come into the university, you must do statistics, groan, And so every young man would think, oh, this is all rubbish. There's just boffins and silly people with their little numbers. I say, no, no. Statistics has an origin etymologically with both the state, as in all those statisticians that worried about eugenics and populations breeding too hard and quickly and dumb people overpopulating, etc. But it also has a relationship to delight, because the standing outside of yourself is also an ecstasy. And here we have a superb, Jacques Lacan uses this on just the head of Saint Teresa in one of his books, but the whole thing's actually quite gripping, really, because with what Bernini did here, this thing is he's based it. He tried to do Veritas Filia Temporis himself as a huge sculpture and failed because it was just too big. But anyway, here you see the light coming down. It used to be the light from heaven, but now it's the fidelity from earth of wanting to get to where the eventualities might be. The heavy marble floats up. What? By the power of God. Here it's actually data gathered, brought together to deliver insights. It's resurrectional. All this scattered, mute stuff that humanity leaves behind is brought together by someone who cares about it to have it speak its insights. Saint Teresa is filled with ecstasy, and there's, if you haven't read Saint Teresa, you should, because it's one of the first points of Western subjectivity that has a sort of visceral reality to it. Anyway, here, it's the reader who becomes ecstatic, because you can say, oh, this is what I can now do. And the logos that pierces the heart, there's that little golden arrow that she talks about being pierced by. Here it's the actual notion that expertise, which is one of our biggest problems in the West, becomes tight. It only intervenes at the point where it's contextually appropriate. One of the biggest problems with expertise alone is that it doesn't know when to stop, so things keep going. Anyway, so just finally, in terms of what this means, one of the reasons why I've come this distance to talk this stuff is that there's actually a major threshold arriving, of which this conference is probably going to look back in history as being one of them, in that it's not just that there's correspondence analysis, there is now three important things. One is there is R. R is transforming things in ways that people have yet to really comprehend, and I'm doing a lot of that myself. Two, there is Bertin's graphics, which has now gone into grammar of graphics, ggplotting thing, but it's also in ProtoViz, spelled ends with an S, ProtoViz, which is in the browser. So people can interact with graphs. 1,000 people can interact with a complex hyperspace across the planet to get to the bottom of something, unheard of before. And finally, those two logics then relate to the whole question of how you write this down. And so you have sweave or sweave in R, which is kind of like a macro where you can construct what you want to write. Now, in this context, a space, if you draw a line across a space, that's a journey that is travel, which is a discourse that can be spoken through the categories of the variable, which can be percentage to tell a story. I know that's very compressed, but trust me, this actually makes a difference. So on that note, I just want to recommend that if you're interested in any of this, you can see I've got a blog there at richard.volpato.net, and my email is richard@volpato.net. And finally, I just make a plea that we give greater institutional salience to Benzacre in terms of all the Wikipedia pages, the maths genealogy pages. There are many different instances where, from where I sit and I say to people, this matters. They say, oh, how often is it updated? How many people are involved? It matters. So on that score, I just make a plea that we all try and expand that range. Thank you.